After years of serving far from home, Mark finally came back to the town he grew up in. The old wooden house where he'd spent his childhood was sealed shut, the backyard swallowed by weeds that reached past his knees. Folks in the neighborhood couldn't quite remember when his mother had left, only that a grey car had rolled up in the middle of the night, and she was gone. When Mark tracked her down to a nursing home on the edge of town, the first thing he saw wasn't his mother at all. It was her medical file with a forged signature and a slip of paper tucked behind a picture frame. If you're reading this, then maybe my time is already up. Who had taken her away, and why did every single document claim that Mark had agreed to it? Mark Callahan stepped off the bus at dusk, the autumn wind carrying the bite of cold earth and a faint trace of ash. The station was deserted, nothing but a faded sign and the squeak of a gate in the wind. He followed the dirt road back to his mother's old house, the paint peeling, the roof tiles leaning like tired shoulders. On the porch, he rested his hand on the doorknob. No one to greet him, no dog barking, no light in the windows. When he pushed the door open, the hinge groaned dry and sharp, dust hung thick, and the air smelled of mildew and cooled ashes. Above the fireplace hung a photograph of him as a boy, standing beside his mother, the frame cracked and tilted. Mark stood there, staring, without reaching for it. The dining table was still set, 4 chairs lined neat, except one pulled back as if someone had just stood up and left. On the table lay an old envelope, its corner blurred with water, a pencil note scrawled in haste, "Nursing home, room 12. No name, no address." Mark slipped it into his pocket, his eyes scanning the silence of the room. The window was left ajar, a hand-stitched handkerchief fallen onto the floor. From upstairs came a faint sound. He climbed slowly, listening hard. The bedroom door was left partly open, the bed covered in a white sheet, untouched and empty. The wardrobe gaped a little, carrying the must of old cloth. From the porch outside came the grind of wheels on gravel. "Mark, that you?" "Yes, Mum, it's me, Miss Ruth. You're back. Your mama doesn't live here anymore." His heart stumbled. Where? Where did she go?" Miss Ruth tightened her fingers around the handle of her cart. "They took her to a nursing home. Been a while now. Nobody told you?" Mark shook his head. "I didn't get a thing." She dug into her coat pocket, pulled out a slip of paper, and handed it over. "Here's the address. But you'd best not wait. She's weak." He held it, looked down. It matched the note in the envelope. Same words, room 12. He nodded, murmured thanks, but Miss Ruth had already turned away, cart rattling quietly down the slope, like their conversation had already run its course. Mark stepped back into the house, stood in the doorway. His eyes caught on something lying near the leg of the table, a pair of worn house slippers, his mother's, one strap torn. He bent down, turned one over. Beneath it was a small card, the handwriting unmistakable. "If you come home and I'm not here, don't be angry. I've only gone someplace else for a while." Mark closed his eyes. A breeze slipped through the crack in the door, carrying the faint chime of the wind bell hanging on the porch. Then he opened them, looking out over the empty yard. The dust of the road still clung to his army boots. The next step would take him somewhere toward reunion or toward goodbye. He gripped the nursing home address in his hand, the weight in his chest pressing down like stone. Night had fallen by the time Mark stopped in front of the faded sign that read, "Rosewood Nursing Home." He stepped inside, the door creaking as it gave way, and the smell of disinfectant hit him hard. It pulled him back to his years in uniform places where men were patched up, places that smelled like bleach and metal but still carried some pulse of life. Here, though, there was none of that, just silence. A long corridor stretched ahead, under sickly fluorescent light. Mark walked slow, every step making him feel like he was drifting deeper into some cold nowhere. A few elderly folk sat slumped in chairs along the walls, their eyes empty. One man kept twisting a wedding ring round and round his finger. A woman clutched a broken comb like it was worth a fortune. Nobody looked up. Not a sound came from them. His boots clicked loud against the floor. Then a man's voice, soft but steady, called out from behind the reception counter. "You, the Callahan boy?" Mark turned. A man in a mouse-grey shirt and a dark tie stood behind the little window of an office door. He opened it, stepped out, and offered his hand. "Harold Green. I manage this place." The handshake was brief, but it told Mark everything. Those fingers felt like paper pressed flat. No warmth, no life in them. No kindness in the man's eyes either. Just a formality, a box checked. "You came late," Harold said in the same steady tone. "Things aren't what they used to be." Mark didn't ask right away. He just nodded, his eyes drawn down the hall on the left, where a small sign marked long-term care. He knew that's where she was. "Room 12. Harold led the way, his leather shoes making no sound at all, his back stiff like a ruler. Mark followed, his gaze running over the brass nameplates on each door. Every closed door was a story he didn't know, and likely nobody else cared to tell. He remembered mornings back home, when his mother would swing open the kitchen door, tapping the table to rouse him out of bed. He remembered nights she came home late from work, her arms full of white magnolias, saying that as long as there was a little beauty in the house, people wouldn't feel so tired. To him, she'd always seemed strong, untouchable, but now she was somewhere behind one of these doors, alone, among people who couldn't even recall their children's names. Harold stopped in front of room 12. "Mrs. Callahan doesn't talk much anymore," he said. "She may not recognize you. Happens all the time here." Mark almost asked something back, but the words never came. He just lifted his hand toward the doorknob, and it trembled, not from fear, but from something deeper, a distance that had grown without him even knowing. "You've got 15 minutes, Harold added, turning away before the door even opened. His voice stayed flat, like he was reading office hours off a clock. The door gave a soft push. Inside, the smell of medicine was lighter but still hung there, mixed with something musty and warm. The room was small, a bed, a nightstand, a single chair. Nothing on the walls. No family photos, no pictures. Just a plain white curtain moving slightly in the draft from a half-open window. A woman sat by that window, her back turned. Her hair was completely white now, hanging to her shoulders, her spine slightly bent. Her hands rested in her lap, still as stone. A pale grey sweater wrapped around her. Mark stood frozen. A long silence filled the room. "It's me, Mark," he said low, just enough for her to hear if she wanted to. Nothing. He took another step closer, stood beside her. From the side, her face looked thinner than he remembered. The wrinkles cut deep, carved by time and something unnamed. Her eyes were closed or maybe half open, but seeing nothing. "I'm home, Mum." Her lips moved, so slowly it barely looked real. A whisper came out, thin as dry leaves shifting in the wind. Mark sat in the chair, not sure what else to say. She didn't turn toward him, didn't answer. And then, in a voice broken, barely words at all. "Who are you?" His chest clenched tight. He didn't answer. He just watched her for a long time. On the nightstand sat a small notebook, wedged under a glass of water. One corner stuck out, with faint writing visible. Dosage, change after week 6. Mark sat still on the single chair by the head of the bed, his eyes fixed on the familiar figure by the window. The room gave off no sound except the low hum of the air conditioner. Her question, "Who are you?" still hung in the dry air, sharp as a cut that hadn't yet drawn blood. He knew what he should say, but the words stuck. Some things are too heavy to call out, too raw to soften with a smile. Sometimes silence is the only truth that feels honest. His mother sat small and frail, hair gone silver, shoulders bent, her thin hands folded in her lap. She didn't look his way again. Her eyes stayed on something out beyond the glass. Maybe an old tree in the courtyard he couldn't see, maybe some scrap of memory he no longer carried. He thought back to one winter night when he was a boy. She had wrapped a red wool scarf she'd knitted around his neck, saying, "Don't let the cold wind cut at your throat. This wind finds its way into your lungs, even a tough kid like you." He'd laughed, shaken his head, but let her tie it anyway. Tonight the same cold wind pressed at the building, yet she no longer recognized the boy who once sat by the fireplace with hot cocoa, bragging about schoolyard fights. Mark's eyes drifted to the nightstand, where a notebook lay under a glass of water. He carefully lifted the glass, wiped the condensation off, and slid the book free. The cover was worn, the spine frayed, pages edged with age. On the first page, scrawled in blue ink, "Medication log, Mary Callahan." He turned the pages slowly. The lines were filled with dates and doses, little checkboxes, notes scattered between. Some weeks were missing, some days repeated without reason. He didn't know much about prescriptions, but one note stopped him cold. In week 6, written in red ink, increase dose, switch to extended, release, do not report back. Underneath were initials, sharp and foreign, not his mother's handwriting. He looked at her again. She didn't turn. He had no idea what had been put into her body or what had been taken from her mind. This was the woman who once remembered every detail of his life, how he hated peas, how his tooth ached, but he never admitted it, how his left shoulder ripped a shirt in a schoolyard fight. She had held every piece of him that others would have dismissed, yet now she couldn't even call his name. Mark closed the notebook and laid it back gently, his hands pressed tight against his knees. In the war, he'd seen men drop from a single stray bullet, seen field tents turned into morgues overnight. But this wasn't flesh torn apart, it was something slower, quieter, that hollowed a person until the core was gone. His mother shifted. She lifted a hand to brush away a strand of hair from her forehead. The movement was slow, each motion drained of strength. Then she turned, just slightly, and her eyes met his. "You work for the insurance company, don't you?" she murmured again. Mark swallowed hard and shook his head. He didn't know if she saw it. "Mom, don't you know me?" His voice cracked, just enough to betray him. Her brow furrowed, not with effort to remember, but with a faint discomfort. "Mark died already," she whispered. It hit him like a rope cinched around his chest. She turned her face back to the window. And just like that, the moment was over. He said nothing more. Couldn't. Some pains were meant to be carried in silence, not blurred with explanations. Mark rose and moved to the window. Outside lay a small yard, oak trees nearly stripped bare. The wind bent the grass, and in the glass pane her reflection shook and warped, ghost-like. He turned back. She had sunk into the pillow, eyes closed, her breath steady. Mark pulled the thin blanket up over her chest, careful as she once had been when he was fevered as a child, not to wake her, not hoping for a miracle. Just a last act of care, before leaving a room that was both refuge and proof of something broken that time would never mend. His hand found the doorknob, ready to leave, when the hall light flickered off and on again. He froze instinct, the kind that never left a soldier, alert to even the smallest shift. On the table, beneath the notebook, he noticed a folded slip of paper tucked between pages. He stepped back, opened it. The handwriting was jagged, hurried. "If Mark comes back, don't let Harold know. Remember the old window." Mark's heart slammed in his chest as he read it. Room 12 stayed as quiet as before. Mark stood by the window, the folded slip of paper tucked safe in his jacket pocket. He didn't know yet what to believe or where to even start, but that note had made one thing clear: he couldn't just walk out of this place like some son who'd finished a polite visit. Something was wrong. And the wrongness wasn't just in his mother's broken memory, it was in how everything here felt too neat, too smooth, too silent. The door opened without warning. A young nurse stepped in, her white coat wrinkled along the back hem, brown hair tied in a tight knot. She didn't look at him first. Instead, she smiled at Mary the way you smile by habit, a ritual repeated daily. She pulled a fresh bandage and a small pill case from her pocket. Mark stepped back, giving her space, though his eyes stayed fixed on every move. Mary didn't stir, didn't speak. The nurse, her nameplate read. Sarah began unwrapping the gauze on his mother's wrist, her hands practiced, gentle. She said nothing until she was nearly done. Then she glanced up, her voice so soft it was almost lost under the hum of the air. "There's something you don't know. She didn't choose to come here." The words hit Mark like a stone dropped in still water. He froze. The thought had crossed his mind, but he'd kept it buried under logic. She was old. She needed care. This was normal. But if she hadn't chosen, who had? Sarah didn't add a thing. She set the pill case down, crossed to the nightstand, pulled open a drawer. She lifted out an old cloth-bound notebook, flipped through a few pages as if checking something, then placed it beside the glass of water Mark had noticed earlier. She gave no explanation, didn't meet his eyes. She just rose quickly, turned toward the door. Mark opened his mouth, but before he could form words, she was gone, slipping out fast, as if afraid she'd already said more than she was allowed. The door closed gently, but in his ears it sounded heavy, like someone had bolted shut the gate he needed open. He looked back at his mother. She lay still, no sign she'd heard, or maybe she had and could no longer respond. In the yellow glow of the room, her face was etched deep with time, but under her hairline he noticed something, a faint purple bruise along the temple, that pulled him forward, toward the nightstand. The cloth-bound notebook wasn't like the standard medical logs he'd seen in clinics overseas. This one was older, pages yellowed, handwriting uneven, some lines bold, some faint, some crossed out, some erased. He skimmed the first pages. Daily notes, simple entries. Half a bowl of porridge. Difficulty walking. Interrupted sleep. Then at week 3, one line in red pencil. Mrs. Callahan is not cooperating with treatment, showing reaction to new medication. Beneath it, a signature blurred, hard to make out, but he saw the initials H. Green. Harold Green, the stiff manager who led him here, whose handshake felt like dry paper. If they'd changed her treatment without family consent, then why? For what reason? Mark closed the notebook, left it where it was. He sat again, pulling the folded note from his pocket, reading it once more. If Mark comes back, don't let Harold know. Remember the old window. He looked at the window. Double-paned glass, aluminum frame, new. Nothing about it said, old. But below the sill, on the wood trim outside, he noticed a horizontal brace nailed in, blocking it from opening. And at the lower right corner, scratched faintly into the wood, uneven knife marks formed numbers 0408H. Not a date he recognized. Maybe a code. He turned back to his mother. Her eyes were closed now, drifting somewhere between wakefulness and sleep. A thought formed heavy in his mind. Maybe she had seen something. Maybe she knew. And if she'd felt watched or cornered, she would have hidden notes, carved numbers, left signals. Sarah, that young nurse, she wasn't the first to notice something was off. Mark stepped out into the hallway, careful, quiet. Sarah was nowhere. The nurse's station sat empty, the desk lamp left on. A logbook lay open, a few lines scrawled in blue pen, then abandoned mid-sentence. He leaned closer. One entry caught him: morning meds, had been scratched out and replaced with alternate, type 3. No name of the drug, no reason given. His gut tightened. This wasn't just a home for the aging. This was a place where someone was doing something behind the curtain, quiet, deliberate, practiced. He leaned back against the wall, breathing slow, his mind running. And then from the far end of the corridor, a whisper slipped behind him, a woman's voice, low, trembling. "Are you really her son?" Mark returned to room 12, just as the hall lights were coming on. The long tubes overhead spilled their cold glow down on the tiled floor, stretching shadows across the corridor. Inside, the room was as still as when he had left it, but something in the air had shifted. It wasn't just the stale mix of medicine and cloth anymore. He didn't go straight to the chair this time. Instead, he walked slowly toward the nightstand and pulled open the small drawer. Inside lay a pocket-sized notebook. No name, no date, just a few rough letters scrawled at the corner of the cover, G12, MC. He flipped it open. Page after page held steady notes, half in uneven handwriting, half typed and glued in later, like someone was patching over a truth they didn't want seen. On the 4th page, his chest tightened at what he read: high-dose painkillers, direct order, signature, H. Green. No explanation, no chart of symptoms, no list of side effects, just an order, a name. Mark ran through what he knew of his mother's history. No chronic illness, no spinal problems, no heart condition. In all the years he'd been deployed overseas, her letters had been steady, like clockwork. Each one mentioned the weather, a bit of gossip from the market, and always that reminder: eat enough, sleep enough, take care of yourself. Once, she had joked about being as strong as ever, just a little forgetful with the small things. She'd even laughed that if she ever set foot in a clinic, it'd only be to visit others, not because she needed it herself. He squeezed the notebook tight. What could justify shoving a healthy woman onto high doses of medication unless someone wanted her pushed to the edge? A faint sound of breath made him turn. His mother wasn't staring out the window anymore. She was turned toward him now. For the first time that day, her eyes didn't look cloudy. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw a glimmer, thin and fragile, like a lamp burning at the end of a tunnel, but enough to keep you moving forward. Her hand lifted, not fast, not strong. Just a slow, trembling reach. Mark stepped close and took it. Her nails were brittle, her fingertips marked with faint lines from IV drips. The feel of it tore at him in a way no bullet, no explosion, had ever managed. A whisper crawled out of her throat, broken but clear enough. Help. Just one word. Mark froze. He didn't speak, didn't ask. Her eyes held his for a moment, then drifted shut again, as though that one word had cost everything she had left. He didn't need proof of her clarity. A mother doesn't use that word unless she means it. He gripped her hand tight, then gently laid it back against the blanket. In his head, the pieces began to lock together. The medication logs with no reason, the hurried notes in the old ledger, the warning hidden in a folded scrap of paper, the changes written in red pencil, the silence of staff. And now this plea that could not be faked. He eased her hand back under the cover, letting her rest, and returned to the desk. He opened the medication log again, skimming for patterns. Week 7 carried another odd entry. Reduced response, increase again. Below it, a red underline, as if meant to stand out to any inspector, but still no name, no clear authority. At the bottom of the page, in handwriting that was jagged and uneven, different from Sarah's neat script, different from Green's tidy hand, someone had squeezed in a line. Not reacting as expected. Observe at night. Whoever wrote it wasn't the same. Maybe a nurse. Maybe someone trying to signal from inside without being noticed. When visiting hours ended, he left the room quietly, tracing his way to the eastern wing where he'd heard a whisper the night before. The corridor was empty, the duty desk abandoned. A pale-skinned nurse with blonde hair pushed a meal cart past. She wore no name tag. Mark asked her about his mother's prescriptions, careful, measured. She cut him short with a flat, "Everything's in the file," and kept moving, her steps quick, eyes turned away. He knew that look. He'd seen it overseas when villagers dodged questions about what lay under their roofs because orders from men with rifles were stronger than the truth. Here, the rifles were paper and clipboards. The uniform was a white coat, and the shield was a signature. Back in the room, his mother was asleep, her breathing steady but restless. Her eyelids twitched, her forehead damp with cold sweat. He dabbed her brow with a warm cloth and sat close. He didn't speak. He just watched every breath. Each twitch of her face, each flutter of her fingers, felt like signals of something bigger, a system corroding from the inside, or a scheme long in motion. When he finally stood to stretch, a soft clink hit the floor. Something had slipped out from under her pillow. He bent down and picked it up. It was a syringe, empty. The needle still glistened with a faint yellow trace. Mark's pulse hammered as he stared at it, the weight of the truth pressing heavier with every second. Mark stood in the corridor, the silver light of evening washing the walls, the smell of disinfectant still clinging to his sleeves after he had bent down and held his mother's hand to say goodbye. The door to her room had closed behind him, leaving only the bent silhouette of the woman who once taught him how to tie his boots, who once tapped on his bedroom window when he overslept and forgot breakfast. Now she was here locked inside a nursing home he had never heard of, under a guardianship signed with a name he knew in his bones was not hers. The feeling burned through his chest, something jagged between shame and rage, as if he hadn't only been driven out of his childhood house, but stripped of the very right to be a son. On the 3rd floor, the manager's office glowed with a dim yellow, like those evaluation rooms he remembered from base camps. Behind the desk sat Harold Green, a man who once stood in a family photograph with Mark's father, a so-called friend of the family. He wore a dull grey blazer, lapels creased, eyes colder than the years Mark had spent overseas, his hands folded neatly over a fat file of documents. "I've only got one question," Mark began, his voice low, sharp as a blade. "Why was my mother put in here without me knowing?" Harold didn't rush. He tilted his head, studying Mark the way a man sizes up someone he hasn't seen in years. Then he slid open a drawer and pulled out a cream-colored folder. "Legal papers," he said flat. "Guardianship granted. Your mother was deemed legally incompetent by a physician, and the guardian isn't you." Mark didn't blink. Not me? Who else could claim guardianship if not her own son? Who had stepped in, cut between them, seized control, locked her away without a word? He drew a breath, forcing back the wave inside him. "I want to see the signature." Harold nodded like it meant nothing to him. He pushed the file across the desk, the pages rasped like sandpaper. A photocopy of the guardianship form lay on top, stapled to a doctor's declaration of cognitive decline, dated to the same time Mark was still in combat on the Western Front. At the bottom, in black ink, was a signature he recognized and didn't. It looked like hers, but the strokes were stiff, missing the grace she'd had in every letter. It was a clever forgery enough to fool a stranger, but not her son. "This is fake," Mark said, his voice gravel. "I know my mother's hand. She never wrote an M like this, not once in her life." Harold shrugged. "No denial, no admission. I'm not a handwriting expert." Mark's fists clenched. Harold's coldness was a pane of glass covering a pit behind it lay something bigger, a system built by people who had agreed to bury his mother in silence, to turn her into property. She had no rights. He, her only child, had no voice, and the man in front of him, hiding behind the title of manager, was playing his part in the game. "Who filed the guardianship?" Mark asked, eyes locked on Harold. "I want the name." For the first time, Harold hesitated. His hand dipped back into the file, pulled another page free. "There's a power of attorney, signed 5 years ago, notarized. She agreed at the time. You were deployed in Afghanistan." Mark looked down. The name hit like a stone dropped down a well. Lawrence Whitaker. He froze. That name carried history. Lawrence, his mother's former brother-in-law. The man who had married her sister and drained what he could before walking away. A schemer who knew how to move papers through back doors, who knew when to strike. He had circled the family's assets before. Now he'd circled back while Mark was away. "I want copies of every page," Mark said, not asking. Harold gave a slow nod, but his eyes shifted, sharper now, colder. The air in the room thickened. "You can request certified copies through an attorney's office. But my advice? Don't stir this up. Your mother is stable here. Any sudden changes could cause trauma." "Don't lecture me about trauma," Mark said with a hollow laugh, though his eyes darkened. "I lived through 10 years of explosions, and nothing compares to coming home and finding out my own mother was locked away without me knowing." He dropped the file back on the desk and rose to his full height, spine straight as the day he received his commendation in uniform. Then he turned and walked out. Harold didn't call after him. The corridor stretched long toward the parking lot. Mark walked slow, each step falling like he was moving through memory, the look his mother had given him when she gripped. His hand wasn't mistaken, not for a second. Clouded eyes, trembling fingers. But she had recognized him. She had whispered his name. A woman who could do that was not legally incompetent. What did that mean? It meant someone was exploiting her. Someone wanted her out of the way. He stopped at his truck. Rain began to tap against the windshield, steady and cold, like a warning. He pulled out his phone, scrolled to a number he hadn't called in years. A friend from service, a man who'd traded uniform for a law degree, who'd once dug through forged contracts in war zones. He hit dial. "Tom, I need help," Mark said when the line picked up. His voice carried no hesitation. "Guardianship papers. Somebody faked them." A silence, heavy. Then Tom's voice, steady as stone. "I'm coming." "Is Specken?" Mark lowered the phone, the storm beating harder on the glass. He didn't know how many layers of paperwork he'd have to cut through, how many names hid behind Lawrence Whitaker's shadow, but he knew this. His mother had spoken his name, and that was reason enough to fight. He climbed into the truck, wiped the rain from the windshield, and fixed his gaze back at the nursing home. It stood there in the dark like a fortress, walls plain but hiding something deeper. This wasn't war with rifles or mortars, but it was war all the same. And this time, the battlefield wasn't a desert thousands of miles away. It was right here, buried in neat folders stamped legal. Mark didn't go back to his mother's room after the clash with Harold. Instead, he slipped through a rear hallway where the lights burned half dead and the air smelled faint with mildew. The back lot behind the nursing home stretched out toward a sagging chain-link fence. Beyond it lay the employee parking strip, A few old sedans and 2 supply trucks lined up crooked under a weak floodlight. The air was heavier back here, the silence deeper. He pulled a battered pack of cigarettes from his pocket not to smoke. The habit had been broken years ago, but to give his hands something to do. The cardboard crinkled under his fingers, the familiar ritual steadying him. That was when he noticed the figure near the row of old air conditioners. Sarah. She wasn't in uniform now, just a pale windbreaker zipped halfway, her brown hair tied back. She didn't come too close, but she didn't hang back like it was an accident either. She stopped at a distance that made it clear this wasn't chance, but not so near that it looked like collusion. Her eyes didn't flinch, but you could tell she was measuring every word before it left her lips. "You were just in Harold's office," she said softly. "Not a question." Mark gave a slight nod. "He doesn't explain. Never has. We see things, but we're not allowed to ask." Mark turned, looked at her straight on. "What do you know?" She looked down at the asphalt, her voice halting like each word had to be pulled up through water. "Some patients. No family on file. Or family but unreachable. But still, there are papers. Those papers don't come from the real relatives. Families try to take them back, but they're refused. Or the calls don't get returned." "Noi." Mark waited, letting the silence stretch, knowing she wasn't done. Her voice dropped lower. "There are medications not in the records. Swaps done at night. I've seen it, but I'm not the one writing prescriptions. I don't get to check dosages." He narrowed his eyes. "Why are you telling me this?" She met his gaze, and it wasn't soft, but it was honest. "Because you're the only one who still looks your mother in the eye." The line struck him harder than any bullet. He'd sat through briefings, reports, condolences mouthed by officers who never cared about the names on the lists. But this wasn't like that. This wasn't about protocol. This was about human truth. He didn't ask more. He didn't need to. When she pressed a small rusted key into his hand, without number or tag, he knew exactly what it meant. "Old storage, 1st floor, west wing," she whispered quickly. "It's not on the evacuation map." Then she turned, walking fast, like she was afraid her courage might collapse if she lingered. By nightfall, the place had gone quiet. Hallways stretched long, lit only by scattered lamps that flickered against the hum of ventilators and the whisper of wind clawing at the windows. The whole building sounded like it was holding its breath. Mark didn't go back upstairs. He circled to the west wing, down a corridor hardly anyone used. The windows were barred with iron mesh. The moonlight leaked through in thin, smoky slivers. He trailed his hand along the paint-peeled wall until he found it the unmarked door. The lock was old brass, rough with corrosion. The key Sarah had given slid in like it belonged. The hinges gave with a groan, revealing a cramped storeroom, shelves stacked with cartons, a humming fridge unit for medical stock. Nothing obvious, nothing screaming out wrong. But tucked low, on a bottom shelf, sat a cardboard box sealed with brown tape. On its side, in scrawled marker, "Supplies B2, not in use." Mark tore it open. Inside were vials still sealed, blister packs of tablets with names he didn't recognize. Labels mismatched anything in his mother's charts. Each box carried serial numbers but no entry dates. Buried between them was a plain envelope. He opened it and found a typed list of patient names, about 20 in all. Beside each, notes: low response sample. Recommend continued monitoring. Trial dosage increase. And halfway down, his breath caught Mary Callahan. He crushed the paper in his hand. No more guessing. Patients here were being used as subjects. For what new drugs, experiments, some trial gone underground, he didn't know. But it was deliberate. It was systematic. A footstep snapped the air. Mark killed the flashlight, pressed back into shadow. The door creaked open. A figure stepped inside, tall, broad-shouldered, no uniform, just a thin white coat draped over him. He didn't hesitate. Walked straight to the fridge, pulled it open, reached in. From his pocket he drew a syringe, uncapped it, drew a measure of clear liquid from a vial, wiped the needle on cloth, pocketed it. No logbook, no signature, just business as usual. Mark's lungs held still. The man shut the fridge, turned, and in the glow Mark saw it, a bald patch on the back of his head. A detail Mark remembered from watching Harold bend over paperwork. The man left, never knowing Mark had been there. He waited. Counted minutes in silence. Only when the building had stilled again did he replace everything in the box. Everything except the list, that he folded and slid into his jacket. He walked back through the hallways, not toward his mother's room, but to the nurse's station. Sarah wasn't there. Only a night shift nurse slumped asleep at the desk. Mark slid the folded list into the open drawer, leaving no note. He knew now. Every move he made from here on out would be watched. The camera in the corner blinked red, a tiny eye glowing against the dark. And as he turned back down the corridor, toward room 12, a door somewhere behind him closed with a soft click. Not loud, but loud enough that whoever had been hiding in the dark would know he had heard. The war had changed battlefields, but it hadn't ended. The siren in Mark's head wouldn't shut off as he walked back into the main corridor on the 1st floor. His palm was still damp from the sweat of clutching the folded patient list, his mother's name circled in ink like a wound. He didn't plan to go back into the storage room again. He'd seen enough. The proof was in his pocket. What was missing was action swift, if there was still time. As he neared room 12, something in his chest rattled like an alarm bell. Not a sound from the building, not some electronic chime, just instinct, that worn-down edge of intuition soldiers carry with them long after leaving the field. The door was cracked. The light inside was dimmer than usual. From the corner of his eye, he caught a figure slipping out, moving quick, turning away before he could see the face. Mark pushed through the door. Mary lay tilted on her side, eyes half open but unfocused, as though staring through the walls into nothing. Her body was wrong, stiff, breath staggered, her right hand twitching. The IV bag above her bed dripped with fluid that looked wrong, cloudy yellow instead of clear saline or glucose. The room was empty. He lunged to her side, yanked the line out of her arm. Blood spurted, a thin line that soaked the gauze as he clamped down with tissues. No response from her body. Her legs jerked, her hands spasmed, her mouth twisted, eyes rolling back. "Help!" His voice tore down the hallway. Nothing answered. He slammed his fist against the emergency button by the door. The alarm rang, shrill, echoing down the hall. Still silence. A minute passed like an hour. Then the door swung open. Sarah burst in, hair loose around her face, a stethoscope slung across her shoulders. Behind her came a man in a white coat, one Mark didn't recognize. And in the doorway, leaning like he'd been waiting for this moment, Harold Green, hands in his pockets, face carved from ice. "Step out," Harold ordered, voice calm as a tax clerk. Mark didn't move. Sarah was already at the bed, lowering her face close to Mary's, shining a light in her eyes, calling her name over and over. But Mark could see the limits pressing against her. She wasn't allowed to touch medication, wasn't allowed to override orders. She was boxed in by rules. "I said step out," Harold repeated. "This is care territory. Unauthorized presence is interference." Mark planted his boots by the doorframe. "If my mother dies in this room, you'll answer for it." Harold's eyes never shifted. "You'll be banned from entering within the hour. Our system already flagged your interference. We have cameras. We have records." Mark gave a dry laugh. Short, bitter. "You've got forged papers too." Harold didn't blink. He just turned slightly, as if the matter was beneath his concern. The man in the coat reached for another four, hung a fresh bag, slid the line into the port. Mark couldn't see the label, but he saw Sarah's reaction, the way her fingers clenched around the stethoscope, then fell open. Like she'd hit her own limit. Mary's body jerked harder, her head lifted off the pillow, teeth grinding into her lip until blood smeared down her chin. Sarah pushed on her shoulders, calling for backup, voice cracking. The room blurred into chaos, nurses rushing, equipment rolling, alarms bleeding together. Mark stood in the middle, torn between being a son and being accused of obstruction. His mind flashed through trenches, through foxholes rattling under mortar fire, through the sound of men screaming for medics who couldn't get there fast enough. He'd seen comrades bleed out because an order came too late. But never had he felt this powerless, watching the woman who once pressed a damp cloth to his fevered forehead, now convulsing under hands that wouldn't dare break protocol. Another nurse appeared from nowhere, lugging a heart monitor. The machine beeped erratically fast, broken, stuttering. Sarah shouted instructions, but the man in the coat pulled her back, his grip firm on her elbow. Mark snapped. He surged forward, slapped the new IV line away, pressed a cloth to his mother's bleeding mouth. The alarm shrieked louder. Sarah's eyes whipped to his, terror written across her face. "Don't let them inject again," she hissed, words sharp, desperate. "I'm not allowed. But you," she stopped, voice breaking. "You can." Footsteps thundered down the hall. Voices barked Harold's name. Mark turned. Harold was at his radio, voice steady, summoning security. The room fractured into madness. Part of Mark wanted to drive his fist through Harold's smug face. Part of him only wanted his mother to stop shaking. She convulsed once more, a sound tearing from her throat, half scream, half name, and every head turned. Then she went still, chest collapsing into silence. Sarah lunged, fingers pressed to her neck. One beat, another, then nothing. Mark stared into his mother's half-lidded eyes, the stillness swallowing her whole. Seconds stretched. Then a beep, thin, sharp, another. The monitor blinked. A rhythm flickered back, weak, but there. Sarah dropped to the floor, palms covering her face, shoulders shaking. Harold was gone. The back door clicked shut. Mark stood motionless, unsure if he himself was breathing. His mother's chest rose faintly, her eyes fluttering, lost in a fog. Not confusion anymore. Something darker. A fracture between life and death, and the line was thinner than a thread. He reached into his coat pocket. The patient list weighed heavy, a stone he couldn't shake. He unfolded it, ran his thumb down the names, stopped at hers. He slashed a mark through it, not because she was safe. Because he knew now if he didn't act, she wouldn't survive another night. And not just her. Others on that list too. A sound drew him back, a scuff in the hall. He turned. A scrap of paper slid across the floor, kicked loose from someone's coat or clipboard. He bent, picked it up. A single line, scrawled by hand. At 3 a.m., the back gate opens. The monitor gave a longer beep, holding just a little too long. Then steadied again. Mary was still alive, but time had been shortened to hours. The clock in the hallway read 2:57 when Mark slipped out of the old storage building near the maintenance wing. In his breast pocket, the scrap of paper still clung damp with sweat. At 3 a.m., back gate opens. The corner had blurred where his thumb kept pressing, as if the words might rub away if he held it too tight. He didn't know who had left it. It could have been Sarah. It could have been someone else working quietly from the inside. But this wasn't a night for doubts. In a place like this, 1 minute of hesitation could turn escape into burial. He had prepped a truck earlier in the day, borrowed from an old buddy over the ridge. It wasn't much engine rough, headlights fading, suspension shot, but it ran. More important, the bed in the back was long enough to lay out a grown woman, flat and hidden, long enough for his mother. She was sleeping heavy, sedated after the seizures had been forced down by breathing support. Sarah had risked her license and more by slipping in the one anti-seizure dose she dared to use. During the thin hours of the night, between scheduled checks, she had unhooked the IV lines, swapped the bag for a harmless diluted saline, and bundled together the real files. Lab results, prescription slips, treatment orders signed by Harold Green himself. She had tucked them into a thick envelope and carried them like contraband under her arm. When Mark came back to room 12 for the last time, she was breathing even, eyes closed, skin pale but calm. He bent close, memorizing that face, the face that had carried him almost 40 years. Never once in his life did he think he would have to steal her out of a place meant to be safe. And in that silence, he realized her stillness wasn't just age, wasn't just exhaustion. It felt like a protest, a silent rebellion. Her body was slowly withdrawing from the world, slipping away one heartbeat at a time, as though escape could only be achieved by retreating inside. And all he could do, the only thing left, was to carry her out himself, no matter the cost. Sarah waited by the back corridor near the maintenance wing. No uniform now, just a thin jacket zipped to the chin. Her arms clutched the bulging folder. Her eyes kept darting to the security camera mounted above, then back at him. She gave a sharp nod and guided him into the supply shed. There Mary lay on a hospital gurney, shrouded in a white sheet, as if she were already gone. No one staffed this wing after midnight. Sarah had learned how to trip the sensors, buying them 10 minutes, maybe less. They said nothing. Mark slid his arms under his mother's frail frame, lifted her easily, though the weight crushed something inside him. He laid her gently in the truck bed, tucked the blanket around her. Sarah climbed into the passenger seat, folder locked tight in her lap. The wheels rolled at 2:55. As soon as the rear tires left the concrete path, a shriek tore out of the building, not a camera alarm, likely a heat sensor, or maybe someone had walked in on the empty bed. Floodlights swept across the courtyard. Mark floored the gas, veered hard right onto the dirt lane that cut across the field. In his mirror, patrol headlights spun into life. Sarah tapped furiously on her phone, then showed him a route on the screen. East Service Road. There's a slope down through the woods, too narrow for their vans, but your truck can make it. Her voice clipped, steady, like she had rehearsed this in her head 100 times. Mark gave a curt nod, eyes fixed ahead. Trees whipped past, branches bowing in the night wind. In the back, his mother's shape barely stirred, only the faint blink of a handheld monitor light pulsing red, green, red, the weakest flame of life. Behind them, the sirens multiplied. Another vehicle had joined the chase. Mark jerked the wheel, sending the truck skidding onto a sidetrack, layered thick with dead leaves. The frame shuddered, tires screamed. Sarah grabbed the door handle, knuckles white, but said nothing. Fear lived in her face, but she stayed. That was all that mattered. Afghanistan flashed through him. A night retreat, ambush closing from 3 sides, the Humvee bleeding fuel. He had driven blind then, moonlight on sand his only map, because in the back his buddy was bleeding out. There hadn't been time for choices, just momentum. Now it was his mother. The same instinct surged. Don't stop. Don't look back. Keep moving. The woman who had shown him letters, who had taped his soccer bruises, who had stayed up with him through fevers, she was behind him now, unconscious, silent, but still the reason every muscle in his body stayed alive. The truck bucked hard as it slammed over ruts. A clang rang from the undercarriage. Mark didn't ease up. Ahead, the faint silver of the main highway stretched like salvation. Sarah leaned over, checked Mary's pulse, then met Mark's eyes. They held the look just a breath, but it said everything. They had crossed a threshold. No turning back. The patrol lights faded behind as the grade steepened, the slope too slick for heavier vehicles. Mark kept his speed steady, not reckless, but enough to keep distance. He knew this terrain. These woods had been his playground once, the hills his mother had driven him up for camping. He remembered the night they ran out of gas, 3 hours stranded on a hillside, her arm around him while they watched stars until a farmer came by with a can. When he had complained, she'd said, "Sometimes being stuck is the only way to think about where you're headed." Tonight there was no room for thinking. By the time they reached the tree line, the lights were gone. Mark eased off the gas, guiding the truck onto a gravel track that curved to a clearing. Ahead, a small cabin crouched in the dark, one window glowing faintly. No sign, no name, just the place Sarah had promised. The engine ticked as he cut it off. Mark stepped out, boots sinking into damp earth, then swung open the back. He lifted his mother again, her body light as if pieces of her had already drifted away. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke. A man with graying hair, plaid shirt buttoned high, gave a nod. No questions, no hesitation. They had been waiting. Mark laid his mother on a narrow bed, fresh linens tucked, a small oxygen tank already waiting. She gave a long, soft exhale, then lay still. Sarah handed the folder to the man. Mark stood, one hand still curled around the wrinkled scrap in his pocket. The world outside the walls was still dark, still dangerous. But at least for this moment, she was out. And he knew, as he watched her chest rise shallow against the blanket, that this wasn't an ending. It was only the opening shot. The real fight hadn't even begun. The sun hadn't risen yet. Dawn was a weak gray, leaking across the ridges and cutting the landscape into uneven slices of shadow and light. On the narrow dirt road, skirting the hillside, Mark's old borrowed truck shrieked as he slammed the brakes. Ahead, flashing bars of red and blue split the dim air, patrol vehicles blocking the road clean across. In bold letters on the side, Northfield County Sheriff. In his mirror, another cruiser slid in behind, sealing the way shut. He didn't curse, didn't ask why. He already knew. He could picture Harold back at the nursing home office, steady hands dialing numbers, voice calm, clipped, surgical. This wasn't bluff anymore. This was official. The charge of elderly abduction was heavy, too heavy for talk to undo, and its cost wasn't just community service or a fine. It was years. It was his mother's last days stolen outright. Mark cut the engine, pushed the door open, stepped down into gravel crunch. Both hands rose slow, deliberate. Dust streaked his face, sweat dried at his collar, but his eyes stayed clear, fixed on the sheriff stepping out of the lead car. A man near 60, hair cut close, silver flecking his temples. Calm gait, but shoulders tight, as if every step weighed measured risk. The air tightened like barbed wire stretched across the valley. Sarah climbed out behind him, the thick folder hugged against her chest. The sheriff spoke first, voice low but strong enough to carry. "Name? Mark Callahan," he said, crisp. "The woman in the truck?" "My mother." The sheriff tilted his head toward another deputy, who circled back to the tailgate, fingers curled around the latch, ready to swing it open. Sarah stepped forward before words could stack against them. She didn't argue, didn't plead. She pulled a packet tied with a rubber band from her bag and held it out with steady hands. Nurse Sarah Whitmore. Medical records of Mary Callahan. Originals. The sheriff didn't take them right away. He studied her first, searching her face. Then he reached, peeled the band, thumbed through pages one by one. The paper rasped under his fingers. Deputies shifted. Their breath filled the gap. They didn't know if they were standing in a kidnapping or uncovering something uglier. Sarah leaned closer, tapped the third sheet. "This order guardianship authorization, signed by a Marcus Callahan." "But Mark is the only child Mary ever had. There is no Marcus." "Look at the notary seal, it's counterfeit. The birth certificate attached? Font changes mid-line. The guardian field is overwritten." The sheriff's face barely shifted, but his thumb stalled over the forged signature. He pulled a pen, marked the spot, then raised his eyes to Mark. "Identification?" Mark handed over his wallet. "Driver's license, discharge papers, next of kin certificate, naming him as sole survivor. All official, all stamped. 2 minutes stretched to stone. Only the birds in the pines cracked the silence and the soft idle of engines behind. The sun's crown slid above the trees, spilling pale fire into the gray, but it didn't soften a thing. The sheriff stepped back, gestured. A deputy cracked open the tailgate. Inside, Mary lay beneath a thin blanket, chest rising shallow but steady. No straps, no marks of force. Beside her, a kit of meds, monitor blinking slow green. The deputy leaned in, whispered to his boss. No restraints, vital steady, medication file matches. The sheriff nodded once. He turned to Mark. "Start from the beginning." Mark's words came stripped down, soldier style. The pattern of forged forms, the unauthorized drugs, the seizures racking her body just hours earlier. He didn't color it. Didn't make it Sarah's burden either. She had already risked everything by standing beside him on this road. That was enough. The sheriff didn't rush to judge. He slid the folder into a leather satchel, keyed his radio, asked for verification of Rosewood's paperwork. Then he looked back at Mark. And this time, it wasn't suspicion in his stare. It was weight. He wasn't weighing evidence, he was weighing trust. "You understand," he said slowly. "This could still be charged as abduction." Mark met him steady. I do. But I also understand if I'd left her there one more night, you wouldn't be questioning me now. You'd be signing a death certificate. It wasn't plea, wasn't deflection, it was bare truth. The sheriff stood silent, rain clouds in his eyes. Then his hand flicked a signal, weapons lowered. Deputies stepped back, engines idled. The air loosened. Mark's pulse eased, though calm never came. He knew this was only one pass. Harold wasn't finished. Rosewood didn't operate with sloppy forgeries unless someone bigger was propping it. Pharmaceutical labs, bent physicians, or worse men who needed voiceless bodies to test on. Sarah sank onto a roadside stone. Her arms still wrapped the satchel, eyes ringed dark from nights without sleep. She didn't speak, but something in her face unclenched. She had crossed the line. And once crossed, there was no walking back. Mark drifted back to the truck, looked in at his mother. She slept as if untouched, as if all of them, cops, nurses, sons, were just background noise in her long dream. The sheriff stepped closer to Sarah, voice clipped. We'll hold these records for review, but Mary Callahan won't be forced back. Not tonight. Sarah nodded faintly. Thank you. No handshakes, no promises, just silence. But silence itself was an admission. Something wrong had surfaced. Someone had chosen to act. Engines growled, wheels crunched. The cruisers peeled away, leaving dust curling in their wake. Mark slid back into the cab, but didn't start the engine. He stared at his mother in the mirror, at Sarah beside him, loosening her hair, eyes far off, catching the first sharp light of morning. The day had started with sirens and commands to halt. It ended with stillness. Not the stillness of fear, but of acknowledgement. Some truths don't need volume. Some battles are fought simply by standing shoulder to shoulder. At the bottom of the hill, the dirt road spilled into open clearing, sunlight cutting the forest into shards. Mark didn't know what waited past that bend, but he knew one thing, certain and solid. This was the first time in years he wasn't running from memory. He was using it, wielding it, to fight for what was left of the one person he couldn't lose. The Northfield County Regional Hospital sat tucked inside a quiet valley, 30 minutes by road from town. 2 stories, whitewashed walls, a roof of faded red tile, old but clean. Not a big place, not crowded with machines, the kind of hospital where people still nodded to one another in the hall. Mark had been here once before, as a teenager, when he tore up his arm after flipping his bike on a gravel bend. His mother had sat outside for 2 hours, a plastic bottle of water in her lap, not saying much except, next time, break before the corner. That day, it rained. Today, the sun was out, but inside Mark it was damp and heavy, just like back then. Mary was wheeled straight to emergency. The attending doctor had already been briefed by the sheriff's office, so there were no questions, no bureaucratic stalling. Sarah handed over everything, the files, the test results, the treatment slips from Rosewood, all neatly clipped and labeled. She'd stacked them like a soldier laying out evidence before inspection. Not one crease for doubt. She didn't linger. Just a nod to Mark, then she stepped back into the hallway, leaving him the quiet he needed. He sat at the row of plastic chairs by the window. The morning sun spilled long across the tile, pale stripes sliding slow on the old floor. In front of him, the half-shut ER door. Behind, a corridor hushed as a chapel. The whole place felt like a dream that had gone on too long, where breathing was the only thing that kept a man from slipping into despair. An hour passed. The doctor came out. Mid-50s, glasses, calm stride. He wasn't carrying a chart. Just removed his frames, polished them with a handkerchief, and looked Mark in the eye. She's stable. Heart rate, blood pressure within range. But, he paused, not for lack of words, but because what came next wasn't meant to be rushed. We found evidence of neurological damage, progressive, likely induced. She's been under medication that affects the central nervous system for weeks, maybe longer. Add her age, and the intensity of last night's reaction, we can't say how much memory will recover. Mark didn't argue, didn't plead, just gave a single nod. The doctor's voice softened, but she woke, and the first thing she asked was, "Where's my boy?" The words didn't shatter him, they didn't wring tears, they seeped, warm and slow, into the cracks of a heart that had been brittle too long, like water soaking dry earth, quiet, but enough to soften what had hardened. He walked into the room. Mary lay propped against a pillow, hands by her sides, breath even. Her eyes didn't open wide, but they were clear. Her lips cracked, but moved with steadiness. She saw him before he spoke. "Mark?" One word, fragile but certain. He sat beside her, not touching, not confirming with, "Yes," just bowed his head. She looked at him long, then closed her eyes again. Not in sleep, in peace, like a traveler finally back to a house she thought long torn down. The doctor returned later with the file. They'd be running more tests, blood panels to track residues, tracing the compounds back to source. If it proved to be trial drugs, unlicensed, Rosewood wasn't just civilly liable, it was criminal. By that afternoon, The sheriff's office had Harold Green in custody. Mark didn't feel triumph. He didn't think about years of sentencing or fines. Only one question mattered. Why? Why did men paid to care choose to poison? Why did hundreds pass those halls each day, and so few stop to really see the eyes of a woman labeled incompetent? Sarah slipped in with 2 coffees. She handed one to him. He didn't drink, just held it. They sat side by side in the dim, silence their only conversation. Toward evening, Mark was called to the chief physician's office. A police-assigned lawyer sat waiting, file copies spread across the desk. Pages had been tampered with, page numbers skipping, handwriting inconsistent. The forged Marcus Callahan still unsourced. Mark signed as Mary's only living relative, agreeing to cooperate with the investigation. Sarah signed as witness, already knowing what that meant for her license. When they left, the halls were busier. Nurses changing shifts, families waiting in clusters, normal life carrying on. But Mark knew nothing would return to normal. Back at the room, dusk painted the window soft gold. The curtain breathed with the evening wind. Mary slept, her face loose for the first time in days. He sat again, feeling for the first time in weeks that he didn't need to brace against collapse. But relief carried its own shadow. The doctor had warned him, nerve damage wasn't a wound you stitched. Tomorrow she might wake and remember everything. Or not remember him at all. Her hand twitched beneath the blanket. Thin, dry, cooler than it used to be. That same hand had once pressed against his fevered forehead, had once clamped his wrist at family dinners when he tried to storm out. That hand, now fragile as paper. A nurse knocked lightly for night checks. Mark nodded, stepped aside. Before leaving, he looked once more at Mary, then stepped into the hall. In his pocket, the old scrap still lay. 3 a.m., back gate open. The ink was smudged, nearly gone, but he hadn't thrown it away. It was proof someone in the dark had helped. Proof that one conscience could change one fate. And if one could, maybe more could. The fight wasn't finished. Rosewood was still standing. Other patients were still inside. The network behind Harold hadn't shown its face yet, but tonight, at least, he'd pulled his mother out. She was alive. She had said his name, and he would not let that name be stolen again. Nearly a week had crawled by before Mary Callahan began to show the first glimmers of true recovery. They were tiny signs, so small most doctors might have dismissed them, but to Mark they felt like miracles. A hand flexing without command, eyelids twitching against light, a sigh slipping out between breaths. Every flicker, every tremor, he logged in his chest like a soldier counting victories in silence. He didn't expect her to come back whole, not after what had been done to her. What he prayed for was simpler, that each morning he stepped through the hospital door, she would still be there, breathing steady, eyes able to open enough to meet the day. He barely left the building, refusing to be gone longer than an hour. He showered in quick bursts, ate meals that tasted of cardboard, and returned before the nurses could call him stubborn. Sarah dropped by when she could. She never lingered, usually bringing fresh updates. The State Health Board had opened a full-scale inquiry. Rosewood's files were under lock. Treatment protocols were pulled apart, dosage logs dissected. Inspectors with clipped tones swarmed the facility. People who had been silent for years began whispering. The name Harold Green, once bland, now pulsed through every deposition, every late-night meeting. Mark let the lawyers and investigators handle their side. He'd had enough of papers and hearings. His battle was flesh and blood, his mother's breath, her pulse, her presence. Afternoons, he brought out an old book, The Wind in the Willows, its cover soft from years of her hands. It was the one she had read aloud when he was small, her voice a blanket pulling him safe against the storms outside. Now he read, steady and low, while she lay still. Sometimes she drifted into sleep midway, but her lips still shaped familiar phrases, as if memory lived in muscle even when the mind faltered. He did the little care himself. Washed her hair, buttoned her gowns, wiped her face. Not because he distrusted the staff, but because after everything, he believed what she needed most wasn't a machine or a chart. She needed him, her son, present, constant, unflinching. After 7 days, she was moved out of ICU into a quieter ward. The nightmares softened. She still gripped his hand in sleep, whispering, "Don't let them inject me again." He never promised. He never lied. He simply held her hand tighter, because some trust can't be patched by words, it can only be rebuilt by presence, repeated, daily, unbroken. The story seeped beyond hospital walls. Local papers carried hushed accounts. No names, but everyone in Northfield knew. The shock came in what followed. Letters flooded the state board from townspeople, demanding every nursing home be reviewed. Families began pulling files, asking questions. The silence cracked wide. And the man who had struck the first blow was the same son who had lost too many years away from his mother. On the 9th night, an envelope slid under his door. No sender. His name on the front. A single word underlined. Urgent. Inside, a slip of paper. Greenwood Facility, West Wing. No more, no less. Printed, not written, no creases, no fingerprints. The paper rough, cream-colored, the kind used in older clinics. He stared at it for a long time. Greenwood. He knew the name. A rehab center buried in the forest, 2 hours out. Once for veterans, later repurposed. Few knew it, fewer visited. A sealed compound. West Wing. Why that wing? Why now? He folded it crisp, tucked it away. Didn't show Sarah, didn't speak. His instincts whispered, some truths are weakened by being shared too soon. Not because he doubted her, but because some paths have to be walked alone. The next morning, as he wheeled his mother down the hallway, she tugged his wrist. Are you still angry with me? He shook his head. She kept her gaze forward. When you enlisted, I thought of stopping you, but you were too certain. He said nothing. The corridor hummed with the soft roll of wheels. I feared if you left and never came back, I'd break. But I also knew no one can live another's life. He squeezed her hand. That was enough. Not forgiveness, not apology, just the raw truth of her love, spoken at last. That evening he sat alone in the cafeteria, a paper map spread before him. He traced the road to Greenwood with his finger, off the main lines hidden by forest. The GPS maps skipped it, just a thin dirt road, forgotten. His nail pressed the dot marked West Wing. His gut tightened. If Rosewood was the surface, Greenwood was the shadow beneath, and shadows hold the darkest things. He knew then. His fight wasn't done. He had pulled his mother free, but others were still trapped. He had spent too many years standing back. No more. By sundown, the valley lay in orange haze. Upstairs, Mary slept with her hand folded loose on the blanket. Her face finally softened. He stood a long time at her side, then pulled the slip of paper from his pocket once more, folded it sharp, tucked it deep. Outside, night air cooled. Inside him, another road opened, not for his own sake, for those who could no longer speak. This time, he would not return empty-handed. And as he stepped into the dark lot, the silence around him felt less like an ending than a beginning. The kind of silence before a new fight, a new reckoning, the kind his mother had always taught him to meet with, his head high, his hands steady. Sometimes what feels predetermined is only the first chapter of a longer truth. For those of us who stand at midlife, carrying responsibility for our parents is not a burden. It is a way of remaining ourselves, a way of holding fast when the rest of the world threatens to spin us into strangers. In a society that praises itself for being humane and advanced, there are still rooms where the light never quite reaches. Those corners are illuminated, not by policy or slogans, but by the courage of a son or daughter who refuses to turn away. A soldier may believe he has survived once he walks out of a war zone. He counts his breaths, his medals, and the friends who did not come home. But the truer test often begins after the homecoming, inside the doorway of a quiet house, where people who seem beyond danger still need watchful eyes. That is where a second war begins, the one without gunfire, fought with forms, bedside chairs, and the stubborn insistence that a name, a memory, a life still matters. Mark did more than shield his mother. He reminded the rest of us that if we do not speak, no one will carry a lamp into the locked room of memory. I am not romanticizing heroism. The courage at stake here is ordinary, the kind that wakes before sunrise to drive to an appointment, that argues calmly with an indifferent clerk, that writes down a pill's name and asks the nurse to confirm the dosage, that returns the next day and asks again. It is the discipline to sit through long afternoons in plastic chairs, to listen when an elder repeats the same story, to answer as if it were new. It is the refusal to let a signature that looks almost right pass unchallenged. This is what survival looks like after the parade has ended. It looks like study, patience, and a willingness to be difficult for the sake of someone who once carried you through a fever. It looks like noticing the tremor at the corner of a mouth, the shift in a doctor's tone, the way a prescription changes when no one is looking. It looks like standing in a hallway and deciding you will not be the one who walks away. If you have ever watched a loved one endure something wrong in the hush of a waiting room, you know the shape of that helplessness. Maybe you saw a parent waved off as confused when you knew they were clear. Maybe you heard a staffer talk around the truth because it was easier than admitting a mistake. The anger that rises in those moments has a specific gravity. It keeps you up at night. It asks what, exactly, you are willing to risk. Sharing these stories is not about collecting sympathy. It is an act of maintenance, a way to keep the moral machinery of a community from grinding down. When we tell what happened, we build handrails for the next person who must walk the same narrow stairs. We make a map. We give language to the fog. Your account might be the small lamp that lets someone else spot the loose step before they fall. So here is an invitation, plain and direct. Have you seen it? Have you seen a father dismissed, a grandmother treated as less, a neighbor shuffled between departments until hope thinned to a thread? Tell it here. Set it down with the facts. You remember the dates, the names, the things that did not add up. Tell it without theatrics. Tell it because it matters. And if you are in the thick of it right now, hear this. There are others walking beside you, even if you cannot see us. We are the sons and daughters who keep showing up, the friends who bring coffee, the nieces who scan files line by line. We do not always win, but we do not stop. Sometimes what feels final is only the preface. The chapter you write by speaking up may be the page that turns the story toward repair. No system will fix itself without pressure from the people it exists to serve. No memory will unlock without a hand at the door and a voice on the other side. Hold the light steady. Share what you know. And when the room grows quiet, do not assume that quiet means safety. Sometimes it is the quiet that hides the harm. Sometimes it is the quiet that calls us to act. Because in the end, protecting our elders protects the part of us that learned patience, humor, and love from them. Speak when it is difficult. Stand when it is lonely. Stay when others leave. Step by step, night by night.